Rachel Jones, Dr. Rachel Jones, and I run my own company in Strata, which is a design strategy organisation working in technology.
Okay. When I had a quick look on the Strata website, it refers to you as a digital strategist. Can you explain that a bit?
So I think at one time, I've always been involved in new product development, so the creation, I would like to say design, of new technologies. And as with most design, often a client comes to you with something in mind that they want designed. And you begin there, and you realise that actually what they're trying to design is not necessarily the best thing. And so in a sense you step back from designing the thing to understanding the problem space and what might fit into that space. So it becomes more of a strategic role. And I think as I've advanced in my career, as designers become more accepted, I think I've moved more into that sort of, well, let's broaden this out a bit before we then focus again.
So how did you get started?
How did I get started? Good question. I started originally doing a physics and maths degree because I was always asking the question, why does this happen? What makes this work? So trying to the why question was always at the front of my lips. So I studied physics and maths. It was actually quite difficult to find a job if I didn't want to go to military, which I didn't. And so I ended up doing a master's in computing as a sort of translational degree. Okay. And then I went into software development, and then from software development I was still asking the question why, and so I needed to do a PhD to go to try and understand beneath that, if you like, what was going on in terms of architectures and then so I did my PhD, and then I was approached by Xerox PARC to work in their R&D centre, which was based in Cambridge, and I worked there for 5 years, and then I moved into industry and to more internet consultancy work, and then I set up in Strata about 15 years ago.
Can you tell us a bit about what you worked on while you were at Xerox?
So the interest at the time was about networks, and although my first job had actually been at AT&T building the first ATM network, the cash machine network in the UK, it moved much more into the workplace, and so we were looking at work and organisations and technology, and the way organisations were transforming or being transformed as technology was introduced. And I looked at what's called synchronous and asynchronous communication. Synchronous is the Skype call, the face-to-face, or the group-to-group. And I looked at asynchronous, which is more workflow. It's more what you do now, what's in my inbox, oh, I've got these to do, and then I move on to, then they need approval by somebody else. So I looked at both aspects. Yeah.
So what led you to set up in Strata?
I think that's a good question. It was at the time when the internet bubble burst, and I myself wasn't made redundant, but lots of my friends were. But you could see that it was coming, and it had happened in the States, and I didn't want to be part of that. And I thought, well, let's just see what happens. So yeah, I was sort of influenced, really. I just thought, well, let's have a go. And I actually went about it in quite a professional way. I mean, I remember, one of the first things I did was set up my website, and I think that really helped later on, because various of my colleagues ended up setting up their own companies, but they didn't last very long, and I think they did a lot of freelance work, whereas I really tried to set up something quite professionally. Yeah.
So almost like an entity in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Again, when I looked at your comments about you on the Instrata website. It said that you bridged the gap between technology and the end user. Can you perhaps just talk us through that a bit more?
Yes, so my background is always on human-computer interaction, the way people and technologies work together, fit or don't fit. And at the simplest level, that's the user interface. But obviously, in a world where we've got lots of devices, what we call a device ecology, we're interacting with websites, with work sites, etc., all the time on different devices. It becomes much more complicated, and so it's looking at the way work is done. It's looking at the meaning behind that and the anthropology. So what happens in Japan is very different, more collaborative environment to the US, which is much more individual. And you see that coming through in the way people work and the technologies they want to use or don't use. So I began moving from networks into more these device ecologies, and so how do you design products and technologies that fit in people's work life and home life and mobile life? They're transitioning between the two.
So, I mean, it says on the website you work with people like, or companies like Nokia, Vodafone, that they came instantly to mind when you were talking about devices that work across different cultures, I guess. Can you talk about some of those projects that you've worked on, or obviously not in huge detail, but...
So with Vodafone, it was a new product, a new social network they were trying to develop. And because they in effect own your contact book on your phone, with the integration that became less important, I think. But that was a fun project actually, trying to define a new product for them. What they were trying to do was go beyond telecoms as a service and offer greater added value to what they do. With Nokia, that was very interesting. The iPhone had come out and they were getting very worried. What happened was that what was instilled in hardware had become software. So with apps doing a lot of the functionality. And so the differentiator for the phone was much less tangible. It was more emotive, and it was more about that sort of touchy-feely side of things. And they wanted us, they had a fantastic design studio in London, their World Design Studio, fantastic designers. But the work they were producing wasn't coming through into the products. And so our role was to look at why these more effective devices weren't being developed. And often that was because they had a gated process and they had criteria, and those criteria were very mechanical, they were very functional. They didn't take into account the emotive aspects, the playful aspects, the desire that people have when they have this attachment now to the phone.
That's really interesting stuff actually, isn't it? And especially with the way things have developed now with more portable devices, more, you have such an attachment, or people do, to their devices and what they do for them.
Absolutely. And it's moved very much from the work into the home, and now people are bringing their home devices and it affects their work. So even banks now allow you to bring your own devices into the workplace, which they, with the security, they would have never have allowed before.
Do you think that's a positive move, or?
I mean, I think it's fantastic for my area, human-computer interaction. It's really revolutionised, because at the beginning, where it was absolutely critical were in control rooms like nuclear power plants or on flight decks, or medical devices, which had to be, it was critical that they could be used. And in a sense, because when the web came out, it made it much more competitive. People could move from one website to another website. They couldn't buy a product, take it home and then return it. So that transitioning could happen a lot faster. So there was a much greater draw on making the interface more fun to use, more functional, more attractive. And so that was fantastic for designers like myself, because it really stretched us and pushed us to go to the next stage. And as I say, I think that's now affected the more mundane, more workplace or transactional aspects.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
You touched on health, some health and medical technologies there. Can you talk, you mentioned that before in the talk that you gave here, can you talk around some of those things that you've worked on? Or?
Yes, I mean, when you asked about sort of digital strategy and strategic design, I think this stepping back, so instead of looking at the problem but looking at the broader picture, I've been working more recently with Innovate UK, which is the government funding agency, and we've been looking at problem areas in the health space, and how we can, you know, with funding, attract people to try and solve those problems. So instead of going to what technologies, we're looking at disease areas and where the big wins might be. And using design strategy, I've developed a process where we can work with clinicians and with patients, with all the paramedics, to understand where the big problems are that would make a big difference, and design that process both for sort of diabetes wound care and A&E admissions, and for osteoarthritis, and so set the scope for funding calls. So saying, you know, we need to work through the flow through A&E. So people who've got a response to that, a solution to that, please come forward. Yeah.
It's really interesting. How did you get into that area?
So I suppose through my career I've been particularly interested, as I say, in new products, but then the innovation process as part of that. And I was involved in running various mentoring programs, both by the Design Council, the BBC, Reuters, BT, where you look at groups and how you mentor them to stand back from the product and look at the big picture and make it the best possible in that area. And that's been taken up by Innovate UK as well. So rather than just take a more technology approach and understand, although that's critical as well, to sit together, where a new technology is coming out, what you might look at as well is where the problems are, and therefore bring the technology into those problem spaces.
Yeah. So it turns the problem, or turns the issue round.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I also came across some things when I was researching your background about big data and Internet of Things, and how have you gone into those areas? How does that fit with, does it fit with the health area, or is it different?
Well, it's an interesting question. Internet of Things.
It's very topical, isn't it?
It's very topical. So Internet of Things, essentially it's come about because we can get sensors which are much cheaper and smaller. We've got communications, better communications, so we can communicate with those sensors. Those sensors create data. We've got better tools for handling data. And somehow the analytics sit on top trying to make sense of that data. So given those four aspects, that's really what Internet of Things is about. Now it can hit the health space at two levels. So one level is the device level. So where I've seen an example where you have a catheter. Catheters can break, but if you can measure the stress on the catheter, you can send an alert before the catheter actually breaks, which can be really problematic. So that's a small sensor on the catheter that indicates the stress level on the material. And so you can replace the catheter much quicker. That's one example. Another example is where individuals, perhaps instruments, different technologies, beds, people, are patients, have some form of identifier. So you can see automatically who's been to visit a patient, what they might have done over time, and as a result record that, perhaps for legal purposes, but also perhaps look at resource flow. So is the operating theatre being used to best effect? Is it better we bring patients down earlier? You can ask lots of questions then to improve that flow through a hospital. So those are two examples, as well as the wearable side. I've been involved mainly through Innovate UK, again in scoping the funding calls, of which the UK is actually one of the leaders in Europe anyway. And the government's invested a huge amount trying to develop Internet of Things in the UK, from, as I say, that sort of small micro level right up to the broader systems level. And I was involved specifically in a workshop run by Innovate UK where we were facilitating bringing together the creative industries, the design, the understanding of people, geographies, the understanding of objects and histories of objects, along with hardware people and software people and business people, and running a 2-3 day workshop, bringing them together to try and create a sort of cross-disciplinary projects, because that's where the value seems to be. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. I suppose, given you've talked about quite a range of things there, can you perhaps reflect on the changes that you've seen? So say from a technological point of view, so perhaps, I don't know, from the kind of technologies you were using perhaps when you were doing your PhD and studying,
Yes.
to where things are at now, what you're using on a daily basis,
Yes.
and how that's informing your work.
Yes. Well, when initially my first job was AT&T, so it was network. So we were literally putting wires into creating connections for people. So different big organisations like banks are getting connected with other parts of themselves. And in a sense, that's come full circle with things like Raspberry Pi, where again we're back to the electronics and then the programming on top. So it's quite an interesting circle. So what have I seen as the differences? In a way, human-computer interaction has become much more about branding and communications and social networks. And actually, the web is a really simple user interface. It's one page. And okay, you can have control parts of that, but it's, in a sense, it's almost going back, where you're very limited in what you can do. So the colour has exploded, the branding, the communications, the social networks, but the technology itself has not really developed in a way. So it's interesting. Where do I see it going, I suppose, might be your next
It was exactly my next question.
Where do I see it going? Well, I think the whole Raspberry Pi thing is, and that Arduino and all the other toolkits that are out there, fantastic. Really exciting, especially for younger generation. But in some ways, I think digital has moved on now. I think we're talking about biotech and the growth of biotech, particularly in the Cambridge area, is fantastic. So I think there's a lot of work at the moment around the data from the Internet of Things, both in the sort of industrial side, the manufacturing side, and the analytics side.
I guess they were quite good at creating data, but analysing it and using it is probably what I would say is what we're not so good at.
Yes. and making sense of it. I've done some work on visualization and brought in different people working in that area. And there still needs to be an interpretation of it. And mixing that sort of human side, the analytical, the questioning, with the data is where it's key, and bring the tools to the point where you can answer those questions. I think that's interesting, yeah.
You talked about mentoring. You mentioned the word, you used the word mentoring. It made me think, it's probably not quite what you meant, but about people that have influenced you. Are there any that sort of key people or moments, that pivotal moments, I guess, that have made you who you are now? Or?
I went to a girls' school where, you know, in my A-level I had to be taught how to use a Wheatstone bridge. They had two of us doing physics. But fortunately my father was a physicist, and I think, not that he taught me to use a Wheatstone bridge, but to be open to those questions, to make it acceptable to be interested in that area, I think was critical. So a way of thinking perhaps was fostered. And then through my career I've met various people. I spent a while in Germany working on a European research project, and the chap leading that was very inspirational, and that really inspired me to go and do a PhD. And my PhD supervisor, Chris Hind, was fantastic as well. So I've been fortunate in finding really, really good people who've helped me along, yes. But there aren't many. Yeah. Unfortunately.
So what motivates you to do what you do?
I suppose I'm still answering the question why.
Yeah, that's
so
come across really strongly,
I'll live
actually.
With.
But yeah.
And I like variety. I like variety of projects. And I suppose, I mean, I'm not a geek, but I love technology. I find it interesting. Although I'm probably not someone who easily gets my hands dirty, actually, who actually does stuff. But I love the broader view of technology, the architectures, the concepts. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So what would you consider your key achievements, I guess?
What are my key achievements?
That's a really hard question to ask someone, but
I know my nephew asked me what products I produced.
Okay.
And it's really hard to say because they're software and often quite ephemeral and of their time. So I have some patents that I was involved in developing. I think bringing a more human side into the debate around technology, a human both in a cognitive, social, anthropological, design side. And I think being able to see some clarity through a problem area is where my value lies. And so having done that in various situations, various projects, and I enjoy doing that. So.
What would you like to do in the future then? Have you got any big aims or big things that you're hoping you might achieve or get to do?
No, and I've never thought in that way actually.
Okay.
I suppose what drives me is interesting work, and so as long as I can continue doing interesting work that I find exciting, then that's the most important for me. Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about the Cambridge area, but would you say that there's anything that's kind of intrinsic to Cambridge as a place that perhaps fosters a certain kind of mindset, or that fosters innovation?
Yes, I mean Cambridge as a place is quite, I think it's quite conducive to thinking and thoughtful people. And I see that in a sort of day-to-day basis. In terms of R&D, I think it's a very exciting place because obviously there's the university, but there's all the startups and the big corporations. And, you know, you can be down the pub in the evening and you bump into somebody I worked with, you know, 15, 20 years ago, and they're doing something that might be related to what I'm doing now, and we can connect over that. So it's fairly small. You know people. I was at the Judge Business School yesterday and I bumped into 3 people I hadn't seen for ages. So that sort of smallness and that network, and people really wanting to do interesting work. So yeah, I think it punches above its weight, I think. Yeah.
I think that's come out in other interviews that we've done actually. Certainly with respect to technology, which is obviously our interest.
Yeah.
But the work you do at Nottingham Trent then as a visiting professor, what area do you look at there?
Well, they don't call on me for an awful lot, to be honest. So the work I have been involved in, they had a 100-year anniversary last year, and they asked me to get involved in a symposium around future cities, which was very interesting, actually. And so we had some really good speakers, and I chaired that debate. I've also set up with them something called the Design Research Society, which is the main academic conference for design, and that's coming to the UK, to Brighton, next year, 2016. And we've set up a group for the DRS around Internet of Things, so looking at things and how they're connected for the Design Research Society. And we're running some workshops down for the conference, and I'm on the panel and I'm reviewing the papers and things like that. And I've also been asked to review their research, what research they do and how they could improve their research rating as well. Yeah.
Something that popped into my head while you were talking was how you feel, or if you've got any thoughts on being a woman in the area of technology. Very broad question there, but a couple of our interviewees have talked about what it's like to be a woman in a computer industry. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on.
Yes. I mean, I suppose my father was very clever and his friends were very clever. So I grew up around, I've not been frightened of clever men, and even if, you know, sometimes they can be condescending, not really taking that on board, and holding my own ground. So I think that was important. I've got quite used to turning up at events being the only woman, or working in an environment where I really am, 2 or 3 out of 100 people. That's common.
Does it bother you at all, or is it something that it's just the way it is?
I think it's silly. I really think it's silly. If you go to Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Russia, you can see equal numbers. So it's got nothing to do with...
So why is it different here?
Why is it different? I don't think women are encouraged. I don't think there are the role models. I don't think it's seen as normal for women to do it. I've moved more into health tech, and the people I've been working with, associates that I've brought into projects, they almost are so shocked that it's, there's a third of women here. And you do. I think tech is really losing out, because having that balance, having different ways of thinking about things, losing 50% of the population is just crazy.
How do you think we could change that if we wanted to change it?
I suppose one area that I didn't grow up as a computer scientist. and I would never have thought of myself as a computer scientist. So that transition from other areas perhaps would help. I was interested because I could see the application of it to different things, even though I'm quite conceptual and I prefer the broader picture things. And I think making it more applied than more abstract, you can do this with something rather than this is how it works necessarily. And I have thought about getting more involved in schools or whatever, but I think I'm too old. I think it has to be 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, young women going in there and doing more work. I mean, I'm happy to help, but I think that's, yeah.
So what do you think about there's been a lot of emphasis on, putting coding back in the curriculum and that kind of thing in recent years. Do you think that's a step in the right direction, or think it might still lead to the same kind of inequalities that we currently have?
What I understand is the critical part is when PCs are introduced to children. And at that point, men dominate, boys dominate, and women switch off. And, it isn't, a computer is a computer. It's not that intellectually challenging itself. And if you look at history or you look at geography, you look what's covered, we need to make computing much broader and much more interesting and offer that intellectual capability. But coding, I mean, you learn maths. You don't, code. Goodness, the number of languages I've learnt over years. So I think it needs to be applied like a design class, and then applied in a really interesting way. But that's probably quite controversial.
No, I think you're probably right, actually. It's a very different way of thinking to the way the current curriculum is put together. But what about what something like this museum does? Is that any different to, what should a museum like this be doing to reach out to young children?
Yes. Well, I
think
think
we'd be reaching out to young children, I guess, is what I should have asked.
I think it's fantastic what you're doing, and I think the events are really good. Both the public talks, which I've been involved in, which have been very good quality, but also the aspects for children, teaching children, training children, perhaps even going into schools. I'm not sure if you do that, but that side of things. Yeah. And perhaps, you could do something with girls and make it more colourful, more intellectually challenging as well. Yeah. I remember a friend's daughter was having to literally type a letter into a Word program as part of her computing course. And that's just not appealing. So it needs to be interesting to get people in and people to transition, because it's really a tool to do something else. Yeah.
There was something about, I think it was related to work you did with Microsoft Research. There was something about amateur musicians.
Yes.
Could you just talk a bit about that?
So that was a project with Microsoft Research with Natasha Milic-Frayling and a professor in Nottingham University, Steve Benford. And we were looking at creatives, really, in general. And in the end, we focused on small musicians. We were particularly interested in how they promote themselves and the social media they use, partly because when they're amateur, they have to do everything themselves. So how do they go about that? How do they pick it up? How do they understand? How do they tweet? How do they market themselves?
So this fairly recent?
It was about 2 years ago. So we looked at a variety of amateur musicians in Cambridge to understand how they were using social media to promote themselves, and as a result came up with different types of technologies, from physical badges to analytic solutions. Yeah. And the interest really isn't in single amateur musicians, but together there's a lot of people interested in music. And so if you look at everyone who's playing music and working in some way towards it, it's actually quite a large group of people. I mean, we notice bands, you know, because there's a lot of jobbing musicians. You know, I'm going to be running at a session at here and I need a bassist, so finding somebody. But also people in different parts of the world playing together, because now the technology allows that, and recording, you know, separately but together. And so bringing together virtual bands as well as, you know, you being able to view and see through YouTube or whatever all the music that's available. So it's really democratized it. So it's enabled us all to be amateur creatives in some way as well.